Another thing to consider is ethics in research. And what does it mean to be ethical? When we are ethical, it means that we need to conform to accepted professional practice. And here are some ethical considerations when we do our research. First is honesty, objectivity, and integrity. When you conduct your research, take note that you have to be honest. You should be free from biases. And of course, you should have integrity. Remember that honesty is still the best policy. And as they have said, even if others are not honest, we should still be honest. Second is carefulness and openness. Our research must be free from careless errors, and even if we have studied different literatures, we still have to be open for constructive criticisms. Respect for intellectual property. So, some of the ideas will be coming from other researchers. And so, we need to properly acknowledge those researchers or those researches where we got different ideas and even some of the methodologies. Presentation of research findings and responsible publication. Later on, when you present your research findings, again, we will go back to the first one, which is honesty. So we need to be responsible in presenting our data as well as in publishing our data. Next is the acknowledgement of research collaboration and assistance. Of course, we will not be able to do our research without the assistance of, for example, laboratory technicians and the like. And so we need to acknowledge them in our research paper. Distortions of findings by sponsors. Some researchers have sponsors, and even if the sponsors do not like what is the result of the study, it should not be distorted by the sponsors. Competence and legality. As researchers, you need to follow legal laws in order to conduct your research. And of course, lastly, human subject protection. If we are going to have human subject in our research, then we need to protect them and we need to protect them from any kind of harm. Now, here are some unethical practices in conducting research that we must at all costs avoid. First is deceiving a respondent about the true purpose of a study. Just because we want to conduct a study, does it mean that we can deceive people? Remember, we should be honest. Asking a respondent questions that cause him or her extreme embarrassment, guilt, emotional turmoil by remaining him or her of an unpleasant experience. Now, even if we do not get the result that we want to get, we should not ask respondents questions that may cause him or her extreme embarrassment or that may cause him to relive his past experiences. Invading the privacy of a respondent. Now, remember that your respondent should be anonymous. And so, if you choose to do this kind of research, then we should not invade his privacy. Studying the respondents or research subjects without their knowledge. This is unethical because all human subjects should know the purpose of the study and also they should know that you are conducting a study about them. Lastly, when analyzing the data, revealing only parts of the facts, presenting facts out of context, falsifying findings, or offering misleading presentation such as lying with statistics. Why is this unethical? Again, going back to ethical considerations, we should be honest. And so we should not manipulate data and we should not falsify data or findings or even mislead other people with our research findings. Now, as STEM students, since we are going to conduct experimental research, we also need to consider some ethical issues in research. The first one is the animal rights and welfare in research. You might be thinking, since I'm going to conduct an experimental research, then maybe I can use some lab rats in the laboratory. Well, unfortunately, you cannot. Why? Because these animals are actually protected by the Philippine Republic Act number 8485. And this is called the Animal Welfare Act of 1998. And the purpose of this act is to protect and promote the welfare of all animals in the Philippines. Now, how about those research institutions that are still using lab rats or that are still using animals in their researches? Well, they enforce the law by facilitating an Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee or the IACUC. Now, all research institutions should form this kind of committee, and this committee will be the one to oversee the process, which is in researches that involve animals. In the Philippines, all IACUC are registered in the Bureau of Animal Industry of the Department of Agriculture. And so, before you can conduct an experimental research using animal subjects, you still have to get permission from the Bureau of Animal Industry from the Department of Agriculture. And so, please consider this ethical issue. Again, before your study can commence, it should be first evaluated by IACUC, and then the papers must be processed under the Bureau of Animal Industry, and then before they approve your research. Another thing that we need to consider is human experimentation. And there are a lot of biomedical researches that involves human subject, and it has raised a lot of legal and ethical issues. And it has concerned not only philosophers, policymakers, lawyers, but even scientists and clinicians for many years. An example is the infamous Nazi medical experiment and Japan's Unit 731, which conducted an ethical experimentation on human subjects during the World War II. Let us take a look at some of the examples. We have the Unit 731, and this was actually known as Detachment 731, 731 Regiment, Manchu Detachment 731, the Kamo Detachment, Ishii Unit, Ishii Detachment, or the Ishii Company. Now, what is this all about? It was a covert biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. And this unit was actually located in northern China, and most of their human subjects were Chinese prisoners. An example of their research is the frostbitten hands. So this is a picture of a frostbitten hand of a Chinese person. He was taken outside in winter by Unit 731 personnel for an experiment on how to best treat frostbite. And the person who actually did the research is Yoshimura Hisato. He was a physiologist assigned to Unit 731, and he had a special interest on hypothermia. So what he did was he would take prisoners and then he would allow them to submerge their hands in ice cold water, and then he would afterwards remove their hands from this water, and then he would wait for the hands or even for the legs to become frozen. And then what he did was he would now do some experimentation on how to best treat frostbitten hands. So what would he do? So sometimes he would let the hands go near open fire, or sometimes he would even submerge it into hot water immediately, or sometimes he would just left it untreated so that he would see which is the best way of treating frostbitten hands. Another example is the vivisection of conscious prisoners. Here is a picture of a doctor who operates on a patient that is part of his bacteriological experiment. When we say vivisection, it means that they mutilate human bodies without anesthesia to study the operations of living systems. So what would they do? They would take out Chinese prisoners, whether they are elderly or children, or whether they are male or female, and then they would inject them with diseases such as cholera, and then they would allow them to die. Now, before these prisoners would die, they would perform vivisection. They would cut out their human bodies, their human body parts, such as the liver or even the stomach, and then they would now compare what would happen to these different living body parts while it is infected with the disease before the prisoner finally dies. Of course, we know the Nazi medical experimentation, and this is one of the human experimentation that they did. So here, what they did was they would put a prisoner inside a water tub, and it's actually the same with the 731, but this time it would be the whole body of the prisoner. They would submerge the prisoner into a water tub that is full of ice or with very low temperature, and then afterwards they would take them out. Okay, so they would see how far could the prisoner live with frozen body. Another is we have the seawater experiments by Dr. Wilhelm. And what he did was he used 44 experimental subjects. They were grouped into different test groups. And what he did was he wanted to see if seawater would be potable, or if a human would survive with seawater. And so what he did was he would inject seawater to the body of the prisoners. So sometimes there would be no water. For the other prisoners, there would be seawater. And then for the other prisoners, he would treat the seawater with Berka method. And then the other one, seawater without salt. So he would now see which of the following groups would survive. And then we also have um, this kind of experimentation where the victims were locked into an airtight chamber. And for this kind of experimentation, they would test the limits of human endurance and existence at high altitudes with and without oxygen. So for this kind of experimentation, they want to mimic what happens if, for example, their soldiers would go to very high altitude. And so the victims were locked into an airtight, low pressure chamber, and then they would change the the pressure inside the chamber, or they would lower down the oxygen. And so they would see how far can the prisoner live with the absence of oxygen. So as you see, these human experimentation are actually torture. And because of these different experimentation, in 1946, there were 23 doctors who were tried for the medical experiments. And of course, the different crimes that they committed during the Holocaust. And so because of this trial, the Nuremberg Code was finally released. And the Nuremberg Code is actually the first major international document to provide us with the guidelines on research ethics. And we are actually following the Nuremberg Code. So, based on the Nuremberg Code, it is necessary for a person to have voluntary consent. This is a requirement for all clinical research studies. It also emphasizes that consent can be voluntary only if the participants are able to consent. If they do not have any consent, then that is unethical. They can also be human subjects if they are free from coercion. So, meaning there is no outside pressure, there is no force that is being held against them. And of course, if they comprehend the risks and benefits that are involved. That's why it's very important for human subjects to know whether whether there are risks or benefits that are involved in the experiment that they will be conducted. Now, also, the code will state that researchers should minimize risk and harm. The researchers should also make sure that the risks do not significantly outweigh potential benefit. Also, they need to use appropriate study designs and guarantee participants freedom to withdraw at any time. For example, if you have a human subject and then you want him to be a part of a research on vaccines and then he wants to withdraw at any time, then he or she should be free to withdraw. And so, when we want to have human subjects in our research, we also need to learn and to know their human rights in research. The first is right to voluntary participation. Take note that all human respondents should participate in the research study out of his free will. They should not be forced or even coerced to participate in any research. Second is right to informed consent. All respondents should be informed of the procedures, the risks, even the benefits that the research would bring. They may also demand a written agreement or informed consent form from the researcher. Third is right to be protected from harm. Now, the respondents shall not be subjected to anything that may cause them inconvenience or even physical, emotional, and psychological harm. They must be given a pre-activity orientation about the purpose of the study to increase their understanding and to remove possible deception. Fourth is right to confidentiality. Now, any information that you will extract from the respondents shall be made confidential and should never be disclosed to the public at all conditions. You must assure that your respondents will have their responses secured and it will only be used for the purposes of the study. Lastly, right to anonymity. So a respondent may choose not to disclose his or her identity not only to her fellow participants but even to the researchers. Finally, the last ethical issue that we must consider is plagiarism and intellectual property. Plagiarism is actually defined as the act of using another person's ideas, words, processes, and results without giving due credit. So let's take a look at some of the actions that may be considered under plagiarism. The first one is when we claim authorship of a work or creation done by another person. So this may be in the form of written text or even in the form of arts. When we claim authorship, when we claim that it is ours, that is considered as plagiarism. Copying an entire written work or a portion of a written text. So this would include the words, the sentences, and ideas. And then we do not acknowledge the author. This is again a form of plagiarism. The third is when we fail to put quotation marks to distinguish a quotation taken directly from a source. So this means that we take one text or one sentence or even a paragraph and then we quote it directly and put it in our own work and then we do not recognize the author. We do not put quotation marks. So this is already plagiarism. Fourth is when we give incorrect information about the source of a quotation. So when we put a quotation and we do not recognize again the author, that is already a considered to be plagiarism, especially if we put another person's name to be the source of that quotation. The fifth is merely changing the words but retaining the sentence structure. So, which means that we just put or we just remove some of the words to look like it's ours. That is still considered as plagiarism, especially if it resembles the original source. For example, we have a sentence and then we just change one word so that it would look like it's ours. That's already considered to be plagiarism. And sixth is using so many words and ideas from the original source that it makes up a large portion of your work. So even if you acknowledge the original author, but you got, like, for example, 75% of his work, including the data, including the interpretation or the corroboration that is already considered to be plagiarized. Now, plagiarism should not be tolerated because it violates intellectual property rights. And intellectual property rights is defined by the World Intellectual Property Organization as the creation of the mind, inventions, literary and artistic works, and symbols, names, and images used in commerce. So when we do plagiarism, when we are plagiarizing, we are actually violating intellectual property rights of another person. Now, when we are violating intellectual property rights, we are actually violating the law. And in the Philippines, we are violating Republic Act 8293 or the Intellectual Property Code of the Philippines. So it says here that this is the basis of ownership of any published article or material. So this will include books, magazines, as well as electronic form. So when we download some journals online, and then we plagiarize it, we copy it, that is already violating the Republic Act 8293. And take note, when we use these materials without recognizing the author, we are actually constituting the copyright infringement. And when we again violate this law, there is a proper consequence, which is a fine or even years of imprisonment.